Suge Knight told the world letting Dre walk was the best decision he ever made. The woman who was in the room the day it happened says Suge begged someone to take Dre off his hands. Suge Knight built Death Row Records from nothing. He turned Dr. Dre into a superstar. He had Tupac, Snoop, and the entire West Coast locked in. And when Dre walked out the door in 1996, Suge went on camera and told the world it was the greatest thing that ever happened to him. But here's what nobody ever asked. If it was so great, why did Suge spend the next 30 years still talking about it? Today, you are going to hear exactly what Suge said publicly. Then you are going to hear what he said when the mask slipped. And then you are going to hear from the woman who was inside Death Row when it happened. And what she reveals changes everything you thought you knew about who really made that decision. Suge, the public story. Suge Knight and Dr. Dre built Death Row Records together in 1991. Two men, one vision, the most dangerous record label in the history of hip-hop. In 4 years, they built an empire. The Chronic, Doggy Style, All Eyes on Me. Death Row was not just a label, it was a movement. And Dre was the architect of the sound that made it all possible. Then in 1996, Dre walked out. No press conference, no announcement. He was just gone. And within weeks, the story was already being written. Dre left because of the violence. Dre left because of Suge. Dre left because he was scared. But Suge Knight had a different version. Every time someone put a camera in front of him, Suge played it cool, unbothered, confident, like a man who got exactly what he wanted. And here's what he said publicly about the day Dre walked out the door. But here's what Suge Knight said publicly about the day Dre walked out. And it was not what anybody expected.
Dre's departure wasn't a loss. 2 reasons. I mean, one of the reasons, it was the greatest thing in the world for me. I mean, if you have a multi-million-dollar company, maybe worth $1 billion or so, and you own it 100% and don't have a partner, and you didn't have to give him nothing but his walking papers, that's great.
100% owner, no partner, walking papers. That is the performance of a man who won. And for years, the world believed it. Dre left. Suge kept Death Row. Dre started Aftermath and stumbled. His first album flopped. The critics said he was finished. Says Suge had the magic and Dre was just a beatmaker who got lucky. Meanwhile, Suge was on every camera he could find, telling anyone who would listen that letting Dre go was the smartest business decision he ever made. But here's the thing about a story you have to keep telling. If it was really true, you only have to say it once. Suge said it for 30 years. But the moment Suge stopped performing for the camera, something completely different came out of his mouth. And it was not confidence. It was not victory. What Suge Knight said in a different interview reveals exactly how he really felt about the man he claimed he was happy to lose. The mask slips. Suge Knight spent years selling the world one story. Dre leaving was a gift. Death Row was better without him. He walked away with nothing, and Suge kept everything. But there is a problem with that story, because in a separate interview, years later, Suge Knight sat down and started talking. And somewhere in that conversation, the performance stopped. And what came out was not the voice of a man who won. It was the voice of a man who was still counting what he lost. Suge built Death Row into a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And when Dre walked out, he walked out with $2 million. That is what the separation agreement said. $2 million to walk away from a company Suge himself valued at close to $700 million. And here is what Suge said about that. But the longer Suge talked, the more the real feelings started coming out. Because this is what he actually said about the man who walked away.
Now, if Death Row was worth close to $700 million, because that's cold, flat-out robbery, to give that man $2 million to walk away from Death Row.
Cold, flat-out robbery. That is not the language of a man who won. That is the language of a man who has been sitting in a prison cell for years, doing the math over and over, and realizing that the person who walked away with $2 million turned that $2 million into a $1 billion empire. Dre founded Aftermath Entertainment in 1996. He signed Eminem, he signed 50 Cent, he built Beats by Dre. He sold it to Apple in 2014 for $3 billion. The man Suge said he was happy to lose became the first hip-hop billionaire in history. And Suge Knight has been in prison since 2018, serving a 28-year sentence, $2 million versus $3 billion. Walking papers versus a prison cell, who really won? But here is what Suge and Dre both never addressed publicly. The question of who actually made the decision to end that partnership. Because there is a woman who was inside Death Row when it happened. She was in the room, she heard the conversations, and what she reveals about who really pulled the trigger on that separation completely destroys the story both men have been telling for 30 years. That is next. Cold, flat woman in the room. Every story has two sides. Suge said Dre leaving was the greatest thing that ever happened to him. Then he called it cold, flat-out robbery. Dre said nothing publicly and built a $1 billion empire. But there is a third version of this story, and it comes from the one person nobody ever asked. Michel'le was a singer on Death Row Records. She was also Dr. Dre's former partner and the mother of his child. She was inside that label when everything happened. She heard the conversations nobody else was supposed to hear. And in a VladTV interview, she said something that stops everything. Because the question everybody always asked was, why did Dre leave death row? Michel'le said that was the wrong question entirely. Here is what the woman who was inside death row when it happened revealed. And it changes everything you thought you knew.
Suge had a meeting with Jimmy, and he told Jimmy, he says, look man, I can't do nothing with Dre. You're gonna have to take him off my hand. Take Dre. You take Dr. Dre.
Read that back slowly. Suge called Jimmy Iovine, the head of Interscope Records. Suge told Jimmy he could not work with Dre anymore. Suge asked Jimmy to take Dre off his hands, and Jimmy said no at first. Then Jimmy said yes. Dre did not walk out. Suge pushed him out. The man who spent 30 years telling the world he was happy to let Dre go was the same man who picked up the phone and begged someone to come take him. And here is what makes this even more remarkable. At the moment Suge made that call, Death Row still had Tupac, they still had Snoop. They still had the hottest label in the country. Suge genuinely believed he did not need Dre anymore. He was wrong. Within 2 years of that call, Tupac was dead. Snoop had left. Death Row was collapsing. And the man Suge pushed out the door was quietly building the company that would eventually make him a billionaire. But there is one final detail that nobody talks about. Because the story of Dre leaving Death Row is not just about who won and who lost. It is about what Suge Knight gave away without knowing what it was worth. And the number attached to that decision is so large, it reframes everything Suge has said in every interview since. Suge Knight signed over half of Death Row Records, the label that built the Chronic, Doggy Style, and All Eyes on Me, for $2 million to a man he called a partner, then pushed out a door he thought he controlled. The woman in the room told the truth. The math told the rest. And the question that nobody has ever been able to answer is this. If Suge Knight knew that the man he handed his walking papers would one day sell his headphones to Apple for $3 billion, would he have made the same call to Jimmy Iovine?